It seems a shame to break the silence, but it's supposed to be a lecture, not a meeting, so I'll do that. First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me to give this lecture. It's a great honour to give the 2017 Salter Lecture, and it's a great pleasure to be with you at yearly meeting. And as Graham said, I'm going to be exploring some ideas about the role of conscience in public life by thinking about some of the key political events that have taken place in our country recently. And the introduction I called Something Rotten in the Public Realm, and I hope we'll have some positive things to think about as well, but I think we do need to acknowledge how bad things have become in our public life as a first step towards improvement. It's widely conceded that our country is in a more serious crisis than most people can remember. Many will say that we are facing more political turmoil than at any time since the last war. At the very time when we need politicians of stature, we appear to be governed by those who have small souls and little wisdom. It's certainly an interesting time to be actively engaged in politics, although for me, a rather frustrating one, when I know my contribution will now be limited because of the combination of the referendum and the electoral system, which forced me to abandon the life of practice, and very shortly I'll be returning to the life of theory when my MEP mandate runs out. Shortly after an election when I was supposed to be the next Green MP proved that the UK only has space for one of that exclusive breed, and before I drift back to growing food and I hope raising grandchildren, I'm very glad to have this opportunity to share some personal reflections on the moral and spiritual challenges of the political life. As I said in the introduction and the leaflet that you've seen, contrary to a widely held view, politicians are human beings. I think that's true in almost all cases, I've got to say. Like everybody else, we are a mass of contradictory emotions and beliefs, mixed up with evidence and experience. All these aspects come into play when we are making decisions. So how can we balance reason and intuition in our political decision-making? And how can this be compatible with the need to act in accordance with our conscience and according to the wishes and views of those we represent? I'm going to use the next half hour or so to explore these questions with reference to two historic national events, the EU referendum and the war in Iraq, and relating them also to my work in the European Parliament. So the first section is about what I've called truth, lies, and Brexit. Could be a book there, couldn't there? Or several, probably. We are told in Advices and Queries to take heed, dear friends, to the promptings of love and truth in your hearts. Trust them as the leadings of God, whose light shows us our darkness and brings us to new life. This is one of the things that first attracted me to the way of friends, because I've always been an incompetent liar. Even as a child, I struggled with receiving unwelcome gifts or passing comment on people's new clothes. There are certainly times in life when little white lies help to smooth social encounters, and my blunt and unforgiving honesty won me few friends. So it's interesting that for many, being economical with the truth is the very DNA of politics. The very first political theorist, Machiavelli, describes the role of the prince as follows. Everyone admits how praiseworthy it is in a prince to keep his word and to behave with integrity rather than cunning. Nevertheless, our experience has been that those princes who have done great things have considered keeping their word of little account and have known how to beguile men's minds by shrewdness and cunning. In the end, these princes have overcome those who have relied on keeping their word. I studied political theory at Oxford, and this is where you start, and I'm never quite sure if they offer you this as guidance or something to be critical of. Sometimes, successful politicians use the phrase constructive ambiguity to describe a time, and we have to hope it's a fairly short time, when they are not quite ready to tell the truth. Somehow, a phrase like, "I will need some time to mull that over," is interpreted as weakness and vacillation and indecision, whereas a confident but incoherent statement will keep questioners at bay. The Labour Party's current position on Brexit seems to veer between ambiguity, inconsistency, and conflict, but during the election campaign, they used constructive ambiguity to great effect. Did they reject the mass immigration that they had supported during the Blair years? Their voters in precarious jobs in the north would wish this, whereas their many voters from minority communities would not, while their suburban voters celebrated the right of free movement. Did Labour wish us to continue as members of the single market? Leaving would certainly cost the jobs of many of their traditional supporters, but if those people had bought into the Brexit enthusiasm, they might not believe this, or have chosen nationalism over livelihood. Labour's concern that their voters were polarised on the question of the EU led them to play the game of ambiguity skillfully through the election period, and the divisions have only been so starkly revealed in the past month. The fudged position on Brexit has allowed all those who were frightened by the Tory government to vote for Labour and against continued austerity. Is this dishonesty or political skill? It's not a rhetorical question. I think it's important that you come back to this in the questions about how we should expect our politicians to behave. What happens if Labour becomes the government and has to take over the Brexit negotiations? Do we stay inside the customs union? Do EU citizens have the right to receive child benefit for their children and send it back to Spain or Poland? I literally cannot answer these questions, which in my view leaves me and you shortchanged on our democratic rights. And yet, by using this approach, Labour has been part of the coalition that has stopped the Tories in their tracks, reversed horrendous policies like the cuts to school funding and the return of grammar schools, and thrown enough grit into the wheels of the Brexit juggernaut to stop its ineluctable, slouching progress towards the cliff edge. Labour's discomfort over Brexit throws into sharp relief the damage done to our constitution by the careless referendum thrown into the political life of our country like a weapon of mass destruction. Our famously unwritten constitution has come to us unchanged in essentials from the 18th century, when Whigs, actually wearing wigs, bellowed at Tories across the chamber before heading out to a coffee house or a chop house in London's fetid streets. Unlike most modern democracies, we have a binary political system and an electoral system designed to support it. It cannot deal with an instruction from the people that cuts across party lines. So the decision to leave the EU has led to the untidy coalitions of the two parties that can actually govern the country, precipitating out into their constituent parts and leaving both parties internally divided and ineffectual, and our government in chaos. While this sense of failed government is disorientating, it does present an opportunity for us to rapidly adjust and deal with constitutional issues that have lain dormant for 200 years. My immediate response to the government's announcement of a great repeal bill, what hubris there, was to use their reference to the 1832 Act that brought democracy to the UK and to call for a new Great Reform Bill. This would enshrine three principles that I believe would help to restore and revitalise our democracy: a fair voting system, a written constitution, and a democratic House of Lords. In a political system based on government and opposition, how can Labour fulfil its constitutional duty to strenuously oppose the government's Brexit plans when voters in the constituencies its MPs represent have instructed them not to do so? With no written constitution, there was nothing to prevent David Cameron from unleashing the damaging and destructive EU referendum with no proper safeguards. If we had a proportional electoral system, the sound opposition to Brexit, being provided by Green MP, this one Green MP, Caroline Lucas, and the Liberal Democrats, would be greatly reinforced. And if we had a democratic and effective second chamber, something my colleague Baroness Jenny Jones has been working for through her House of Lords Reform Bill, we might expect its members to restrain the worst excesses of post-referendum foolishness. Currently, they dare not do this for fear of incurring their own abolition. The referendum, and there's no news in this part, the referendum campaign was marred by lies. We have never sent £350 million per week to the European Union. Damned lies. Our country is not at threat from jihadi fighters disguised as refugees. And statistics. The cooler but equally deceitful projections of economic disaster, devastatingly dismissed as Project Fear, used by the Remain side. A hugely complex question that has fundamental relevance to our livelihoods was so distorted by dishonesty that most people abandoned hope of making any sort of rational decision and just went with their gut. For me, the referendum was a deeply disturbing time. While some people respectfully and anxiously asked me to explain simply why I thought they should vote to stay in the EU, something that's literally impossible to do, many more aggressively maligned my political motives and insulted my beliefs. I have never before felt that the knowledge I have acquired over some 50 years of education and learning was of little use to me, swept along as we all were on a tide of sound and fury that, while signifying nothing at the intellectual level, carried a deeper meaning of despair, fear, and abandonment. Incidentally, it was the first time in my political life that I have personally felt concerned about my physical safety. There were so many shameful aspects of the campaign, but the most horrifying was clearly the death of the idealistic young politician and mother, Jo Cox. In a time that is so rife with criticism of politicians, her life shone out as an example of the best of public life in our country. Although she was not herself motivated by religious faith, she really did live up to George Fox's words that we should be patterns, be examples in all countries, places, islands, nations, wherever you come, that your carriage and life may preach among all sorts of people and to them. Then you will come to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God in everyone. When people decry the public realm, we must recall those who were inspired to do good and who inspire others. And while I'm on this point, I'm going to take a quick aside to give a shout out to the Engaging Young Adult Quakers project on behalf of my colleague, Chris Venables. It's a project working with those aged under 35, which aims to bring new life, energy, and vibrancy into Quaker life and Quaker meetings. Chris is hoping to revitalise the part played by Friends in the world, including the need for action on issues relating to peace, justice, and climate. If we're interested in enhancing the role of conscience in public life, and I think we are, then ensuring the involvement of more Friends in public life is a useful pathway to achieve that. As well as the loss of regard for our public figures, the referendum campaign also effectively undermined the central motivation for the European project, keeping the peace in our continent after centuries of devastating war. As we mark the centenary of the beginning of the appalling slaughter at Passchendaele, I believe we should restate our commitment to this aspect of the project, whatever we think about the UK's membership of the EU. And we should acknowledge the achievement of the founding fathers of the Union, whose vision and achievements have meant that nobody of my generation has been called upon to fight a war on our continent. When people say politics is the art of the possible, they are usually telling me that I am a hopeless idealist who had better come down to earth sharpish. But this adage should really have been used of those who sold the Brexit pig in a poke. It is impossible to achieve frictionless trade, the frictionless trade the government says it wants, without membership of the single market. It is impossible to have the same levels of personal freedom and personal prosperity we have now without EU membership. And in a globalized world, we cannot have full sovereignty, and our greater influence and power as a nation can be achieved through cooperation with others, not through some outmoded form of splendid isolation. And of course, I don't need to add that we cannot reclaim from the EU the part of the £350 million that we never sent them. When people voted for the vision of Brexit touted by many on the Leave side, they actually voted for the impossible. And trying to carry out these contradictory and impossible demands has reduced our government to chaos. So I'd now like to move on and consider what I think was an illegal war based on a lie and with an absence of accountability. When I became elected as an MEP, I was just saying, whatever we do, we're going to do something on Chilcot. And then the day Chilcot came along, I actually was completely laid out with a headache. It was the most frustrating day of my political life. But my team acted very well without me, which is the great thing about having staff, as all politicians will tell you. Anyway, I think Chilcot has had a massive impact on our political life, probably at least as large in the long run as Brexit. And it was little over a year ago that Lord Chilcot published his long-awaited report on the legitimacy or otherwise of the decision by Tony Blair to join George Bush in launching a war on Iraq. The Chilcot report was a devastating account of a Prime Minister acting out of control and the severe consequences of basing foreign policy on a deceit. This has cast a shadow over foreign policy so that decisions about other interventions can no longer be made in a rational way. The consequences for the Middle East as a whole are beyond measure. The sense that politicians can act illegally with impunity is surely one of the factors undermining faith in democracy. Chilcot's finding was that Tony Blair had given a personal commitment to George Bush and was then bound to drag the others whom he should have involved in this decision along with him. There was no legal justification for the war. The result was the death of 179 British service people and over 250,000 Iraqi civilians. Blair and Bush went to war without receiving authorization from the UN, having judged that they would not win a second UN Security Council resolution. On the basis of the evidence in the Chilcot report, the Prime Minister Tony Blair lied to Parliament, violated international law and the UN Charter. He should be held legally as well as politically accountable, which could best be achieved if he is indicted to stand trial in the UK courts and or before the International Criminal Court in The Hague. As you probably know, there's been a setback in terms of British courts in the past week, and it's still unclear whether the ICC will be able to act retrospectively. Another legal weakness that undermines the general sense that the rule of law, essential to a healthy democracy, is not functioning as it should. But from the perspective of my reflections today, the key question is what proper moral action would have meant in this highly fraught situation. It is clear, to me at least, that Tony Blair acted wrongly, and his reliance on a relationship with God to justify his actions makes his behaviour, in my view, deeply immoral, even perhaps sacrilegious. In spite of Alistair Campbell's stricture that we don't do God, Tony Blair implied much about his religious inspiration in this decision. He appeared to be parading his conscience, almost using it to overpower all the rational arguments that he was taking the country down the wrong route. His apparent conviction that he possessed some kind of hotline to the Almighty was the opposite of the still, small voice of conscience that prompts us to act in the right way when we can listen with attention and humility. It was the greatest recent example of hubris in our political life, and is the reason why Tony Blair will always be toxic, including when he is speaking good sense, as I believe he is now on Brexit. I suppose there is something reassuring in all of this. Even in this era where social media appears to have diminished our capacity for judgment, we are capable of distinguishing between an honest and a dishonest politician when the stakes are high enough, although perhaps we need hindsight to do this. But two men in this sorry tale are notable for having acted in a way I consider noble and which might be considered as acting under concern. They were Hans Blix and David Kelly. David Kelly's death should be added to the sad tally I already enumerated. As an expert in biological weapons, he challenged the Prime Minister's account of the UN findings, particularly the claim that the UK could come under attack from Iraqi weapons within 45 minutes. the claim necessary to underpin the legal justification of self-defense. Dr. David Kelly was found dead close to his home in July 2003. Whether his death was the result of foul play or by his own hand may never be known, but it is clear that he was punished for doing the right thing. David Kelly revealed the efforts that Blair and his acolytes were making behind the scenes to convince Parliament that weapons of mass destruction existed. He was a high-profile whistleblower, acting in the best interests of his country, who was offered no protection and was destroyed. Hans Blix was the man right at the eye of the storm after George W. Bush, Vice President Dick Cheney, and US Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld decided to go to war against Iraq. They needed evidence of weapons of mass destruction to persuade the UN to vote for a war. Without such a vote, it would be illegal. Utilizing powers continued from the 1991 Gulf War, in 2002, UNMAVIC, the UN Monitoring, Verification and Inspections Commission, sent its inspectors back into the country, led by Hans Blix. They did not find any WMD or current programs, just a few remnants from earlier weapons that had mostly been destroyed after the previous war. Dr. Blix reported this directly to Tony Blair. He recommended a continuation of inspections, but made it clear that the war was not justified. He recommended instead to continue diplomatic efforts. As it became clear that his findings and recommendations were being distorted in the public debate in the US and UK, Blix went public, arguing that there were no weapons and hence no justification for war. At this stage, Blair decided to rely on rhetoric and moral force to persuade the country to proceed to war against the UN, joining the US military adventure. The warnings about the impact of a war on Iraq itself and on the wider region have been proved correct, with unmeasurable costs. What the two men I have identified here share is their attempt to follow a rational process and to overturn the political surge towards a misguided policy by using evidence and argument. They both failed, of course. And what is more disturbing is that there were so few, we might include here Robin Cook and Claire Short, amongst Labour politicians who resisted the rush to war, as well as a small band from other parties. So many others could have joined them, but chose not to. Can we be sure that in such a situation of pressure and risk, we would be able to follow our conscience? Few of us are likely to be called upon to make a decision of such import, but I think reflecting on this case helps us to understand the complexity of public life and the huge commitment that is required sometimes to act in the political sphere and stay true to your conscience. And just in closing this section on war and peace, I should like to celebrate the achievement of the UN in taking forward a process for nuclear disarmament through the new Nuclear Prohibition Treaty, signed by a majority of UN member states a month ago. It's the first ever treaty to ban nuclear weapons and should be a huge cause for celebration. If your friends don't know about it, please spread the word. It is not being reported widely. Elaine White-Gomez, president of the UN committee negotiating the legally binding treaty, announced that 2/3 of the 194 UN members had supported the treaty, indicating the commitment of the majority of the world's countries to this process. The treaty requires of all ratifying countries, quote, never under any circumstances to develop, test, produce, manufacture, otherwise acquire, possess or stockpile nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. Of course, it is shameful that the UK government is opposing this disarmament process. Personally, I'm an unashamed unilateralist when it comes to nuclear weapons. Since my conscience would never allow me to vote to use them, it is entirely pointless to vote to have them. But for those who tout the benefits of multilateral disarmament, what can they mean other than the process that is now underway in New York? To fail to support a live, active process of disarmament is to fail to live up to our duty under the Non-Proliferation Treaty we signed way back in 1968. So now I'd like to move on and I'd like to share with you 3 short vignettes from my work in the European Parliament. I could do a little plug here for my newsletter if you're not signed up. visit my website and find out all the exciting things that you never read in the newspapers that are going on in the European Parliament. Firstly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the joy of tax, which is my main area of work in the European Parliament. It's a really excellent example of the way behaviour that would clearly be considered immoral if discussed in the open has been allowed to persist and expand because of being dressed up in the clothes of acceptable economic activity. When you first become involved in tax policy, you are told very clearly to make a distinction between tax avoidance and tax evasion. The first, you are told, is entirely legitimate business activity and amounts to nothing more than reasonable tax planning. The second is the work of shady individuals who break the law and whose activity is tantamount to money laundering or fraud. It doesn't take you very long to work out that these distinctions are pretty invidious and that there are many dubious grey areas between what is legal and what is illegal. We are making great strides in the European Parliament to ensure that money earned is properly taxed by using moral arguments against the shrinking of the revenue, as well as technical changes to tax regimes. For me, it's a wonderful area to work in because it combines elements of a detective drama with a conviction that policy is genuinely improving and can continue to improve the lives of the 99% of the world's population who rely on public services and can't afford to pay wealthy tax accountants. It is the public conscience and the public revelations that are driving these important changes. Once the various wheezes and scams are revealed, the moral and democratic pressure becomes irresistible. Pakistani President Nawaz Sharif was the first head of state to fall just last week as a result of the revelations that money he had embezzled had funded his children to buy expensive property in London. So what begins as a spreadsheet and some technical definitions ends up generating the power to crack down on the global kleptocracy. We also learn important lessons about our own moral responsibility and the hypocrisy of criticizing African or Asian regimes for corruption. It takes two to tango, and every corrupt deal by a foreign head of state requires a smart-suited businessman to complete the deal, just like the deals that allowed Sharif's children to buy their smart London flats. This was brought home to me strongly during an evidence session of our Special Tax Committee in the European Parliament, when the Director of Tax Justice Africa said that when money for corrupt deals leaves his country, it does not go out in a dirty briefcase, but through the computer of a European bank in a shiny tower block. And our own tower blocks at Canary Wharf are deeply implicated here. Don't forget that more than half the companies whose secrets were revealed in the Panama Papers were registered in the British Virgin Islands, a UK overseas territory. I should like to end this section by acknowledging the extraordinary courage of whistleblowers who allow us to cast light into the dark corners to reveal the behaviour that causes the moral outrage that in turn enables me and my colleagues to change laws. In the case of tax policy, the foremost example is Antoine Deltour, who released the Luxembourg files that preceded the Panama Papers. Antoine was prosecuted and convicted for his efforts, something we're trying to change through working with the European Commission to bring forward strong protection for whistleblowers across the EU. I think we might consider whistleblowers as a group to be living up to the highest standards of acting under concern, and that supporting them might be a task of particular interest to friends for this reason. Secondly, I'd like to talk about my work in financial regulation. Following the financial crisis, the EU was involved in a vast amount of rewriting of regulations. From the Parliament side, the aim should have been to protect the public against being on the hook for future bank bailouts. The many finance sector lobbyists had other ideas, and as Greens, much of our work constitutes depressingly unsuccessful attempts to hold the line against these vested interests. I've recently been involved in the trilogues on the securitisation regulation. Don't panic, I'm going to translate that for you. Trilogues are the final stage of legislative development, where the three bodies, the Council, the Parliament and the Commission, come together to negotiate the final form the new law will take. Securitisation is the process of reselling loans, often repackaged and combined into new products. It is the process of financial alchemy, whereby loans, what are essentially debts, become assets. Perhaps some of you remember the Bird and Fortune sketch, where they explain the value of a self-certified mortgage sold to a guy in a string vest who cannot possibly afford to pay it. That was the worst of securitisation, making unsafe loans that immediately went bad, but without caring, because you had immediately securitised them and moved on. This was what our regulation was intended to prevent. There were heated discussions about skin in the game, what proportion of the original loan the bank should have to retain in order to keep it responsible, and transparent reporting to ensure that risks could be accurately assessed. I met a lot of lobbyists at the beginning of this process, but they soon realised they were wasting their time and left me alone. I could feel their pressure through other MEPs, though. The most interesting example was when, at a certain point in our internal parliamentary discussions, several MEPs from the right-wing groups tried to get car loans exempted from the stricter regime. You probably know that car companies now make their profits not from manufacturing cars, but from the loans that enable the purchase of those cars. So the car companies clearly wanted to be able to sell these loans on as rapidly as they could and under the most lax conditions possible. Since the greatest pressure came from German members, I can only assume that this was the shadowy presence of VW at work. What is also noticeable about this area of my work is that in contrast to the tax area, it's very difficult to focus public attention on the watering down of financial regulation and the return of significant moral hazard, with the encouragement for those who benefit to take larger risks, for which we, the public, ultimately will end up paying the price. Although the risk and likely cost is much higher than the moral outrage found in the area of tax policy, that moral outrage is simply absent in the area of financial regulation, which makes it much harder for us to protect the public, and it really enhances the power of the lobby. As Green MEPs, I'm sad to say, in this case, we've been unsuccessful and we were not able to limit these risks in the final package, and we voted against it, although it went through with a large majority. Finally, I'll say a brief word about agriculture and the regime to support farmers if and when we leave the EU. In my role as a member of the Agriculture Committee, I frequently visit farms across the southwest, and I've also got my hands dirty on a small scale as part of the core group of Stroud Community Agriculture. As a result of many conversations with farmers, I know that, like everybody else, the farming community is diverse, with many different styles of farming and views of its relationship with nature and with politics. Although there is no firm evidence available, it is clear that many in the farming community voted to leave the European Union, in spite of receiving £3 billion annually in subsidies. When I asked them why, they cited the problems with paperwork. They had genuinely believed that in the halcyon future outside the EU, they would be given free money without having to account for it, and had failed to realise that problems with payment are generally the result of failures on the part of the UK Rural Payments Agency, based in London, instead blaming everything on an undefined Brussels. A notable exception here is Richard Clothier, one of the blessed cheesemakers of Somerset, who worked closely with Stronger in my part of the world. And there are, of course, other farmers who believe that they should be independent and should compete without subsidies. My own belief is that the NFU, like many businesses and other membership organisations, were complacent that the Brexit vote would be for Remain. For fear of offending their members and confident that the vote would go the way they needed, they avoided campaigning for continued EU membership, or even in some cases even making clear what would undoubtedly be in the best interest of their members. Of all those I represent, I believe that farmers and the people of Cornwall are most at risk as a result of Brexit. So how should I respond to the recent pronouncements of DEFRA Secretary Michael Gove that his plans for agriculture will follow the two main prescriptions of the Green Party's long-standing policy, stopping sending money to wealthy landowners and requiring all farm support to be linked to environmental improvements? I claimed credit for it actually on the Today programme. Is he using constructive ambiguity to smooth a transition to a disastrous free market future in which 90% of our farmers go out of business? Should I call him out for his previous reprehensible record on environmental issues? I decided in the end to congratulate him on his unexpected insight and good judgment while keeping a wary eye on developments. So to conclude, I'd like to think a little bit about how we can go about balancing principles, conscience, and representation when acting as politicians. I always feel the need to conclude discussions of the public realm defensively. The attacks are so relentless, and the standing of politicians and public figures so low, this feels kind of inevitable. So I should say that most of the politicians I know are still motivated by a sense of wanting to make the world a better place. In most cases, I totally disagree with their view of what that might be. But if we agreed, of course, we wouldn't need to be a democracy. And it must be obvious that if you were motivated by personal enrichment, there are many more efficient and less demanding ways of achieving that than by going into politics. So my first suggestion is that we all do more to support and value politicians, if only for the self-interested reason that we are unlikely to attract the best people into public life if we continually attack and denigrate the politicians we do have. I would also suggest that we challenge the media fantasy about powerful leadership requiring instant decision-making and never changing your mind. We don't expect this from any other social actors, and it is unreasonable and misguided to expect it from politicians. Very few decisions actually need to be immediate, and those that are can often be poor decisions, as the present incumbent of the White House is demonstrating on a daily basis. When can the conscience enter into force except during the hours of time spent mulling decisions, time that is necessary to achieve good decisions? In terms of personal conscience, my observation is that most politicians do have them. Creating a discourse that says politicians are corrupt and self-serving gives them permission to ignore them. We should try to impute higher motives to our politicians and then expect them to live up to them. But in public discourse, the conscience should be used with extreme caution. It is worse to perform conscience, as Blair did over Iraq, than to have no conscience at all. Conscience is personal and should be kept private. I believe it is important to use your conscience, not by parading it in public, but by learning to use it as a guide to when you cannot go along with the majority, or you just need more time to think. The process by which conscience guides us is not a rational process, and this can cause concern in a time when irrational decisions are leading us into trouble. What is the difference between being guided by conscience and thinking with your gut? While evidence has always been and will always be important when making political decisions, for politicians, judgment is also vital. Judgment is informed by experience, but is stronger when also informed by conscience. The power of the irrational can always overpower the rational unless we have recourse to our moral or spiritual values, expressed through the determined and persistent call of that still, small voice of conscience. Of course, being a political representative is not a personal matter. When I speak or vote in the European Parliament, I am representing some 5 million people who live in the southwest of England. This relationship is a complex one, which involves understanding the concerns of a huge and diverse group of people, while knowing that some of them elected me as a Green and so have an affinity with the principles that guide my politics. And politics will always be more than government by focus group. Politicians are also required to show leadership on complex issues and to use their breadth of experience to give clear guidance about what is possible and what is merely fantastical or wishful thinking. The Brexit morass is an object lesson in what happens when politicians forget this important part of their role. For me, my conscience would always have made it impossible for me to be a member of any party other than the Green Party, whose origin in love for the earth and its riches is the wellspring of my political energy, but also because the party does not support the use of a whip, because we accept that personal conscience should not be denied for the sake of party discipline. So I'm immensely proud to have been one of only 4 parliamentarians ever to have been elected from the British Green Party, and honoured to have had the chance to work with and for the people of South West England since my election in 2014. I still have nearly 2 years before my mandate as an MEP runs out, and I'm determined to work with my team to continue our struggle for social justice and the protection of the planet we share. And I will always campaign for a fair voting system to ensure proper representation for a party which, while having so few representatives, does support them in the struggle to balance evidence, conscience, and the views of their constituents. Thank you.
Friends, we've heard an outstanding and penetrating lecture, I'm sure you'll agree. But now it's time for your questions and perhaps contributions. I should remind everybody, perhaps, that our focus is not on party politics, but on the values behind them. And I'd also be grateful if those wishing to speak would stand up. The microphone stewards can then be dispatched to where you're standing. Molly's preference is for questions to be in 2s or 3s. So can I have the first questions, please? There should be one. Just there. Ah, yes.
Thank you very much, Molly. That's very deep and understanding. The question I'm going to ask you is that there were 16.1 million of us who actually voted to remain. But we as a group have been completely ignored through the whole process. do you feel there's any possibility of fouling up the Brexit campaign at all? I think because I find that you said the Second World War, I think it's even worse than the First World War, what's going to happen to us in seriousness. And I think we're committing suicide, but I've obviously got that view. But would you mind saying how you think we could deter or finish off I don't like to use the word finish off, the Brexit brigade? Thank you.
In a Quakerly way, you mean, John?
Is there another question? Okay. Grace.
Thank you. Yes, I'm from the Isle of Wight, and there we thought that the Greens had a strong case. But I think the reason they didn't do as well as they hoped was because Labour did better than they hoped. And I just wondered, it must be electoral reform, of course, is the only way to get a much fairer representation in Parliament.
Yeah, because I'm quite sure.
One more, perhaps?
Thank you. One of the things you mentioned in the lecture was the problem that we have an unwritten constitution, that the arrangements of our constitution are not well defined. I think the obvious example is the Article 50 case and the delay that we saw with that going through the courts rather than being clearly set out. I want to ask what hope you think, with the biggest constitutional change that this country has seen in decades coming in the next few years around Brexit, what hope there is for constitutional reform to put it on a more clear basis, having a codified or written constitution?
Yeah. So coming to John's question, I tried to explain in my talk that the problem is if you have a system of government that's based on government and opposition, you need the duty of the opposition is to oppose, so they should be opposing Brexit. That's what our constitution says, our unwritten constitution. But because we've had a referendum in which a large number of Labour voters voted to leave, they are totally torn, and so they cannot perform their constitutional duty as an opposition. So there's no real scrutiny of the government and what it's doing on Brexit. And also, as I said, the House of Lords, because it has no democratic legitimacy, doesn't feel able to oppose either. So, I mean, we can all see the weakness of what the government is doing over Brexit. The battle over Brexit is happening essentially inside the cabinet, inside the Tory party. It's leaving us incredibly weak. We were already weak in terms of our power, you know, in terms of the negotiation, but we're now becoming even more weak. So I agree with you. I really find it extraordinary that, you know, people make statements like an overwhelming majority for Brexit. It was clearly quite a close margin. But having said that, I completely accept that more people wanted to leave than remain, and I think it's important for people who are elected as Democrats to accept that that was the democratic result. But to me, the most serious dereliction of duty on behalf of David Cameron was that there was no requirement to indicate what leaving meant. And that fight is still going on. If you compare it with the Scottish independence referendum, there was a 450-page document laying out exactly what Scottish independence meant. So a coalition of people who voted to leave has been assembled, but they don't all think leave means the same thing. So there's just so many constitutional errors, basically, with the way the process has happened, and that's why we're in the serious mess we're in. Anyway, the Green Party's position, and you know it's also the position of the Liberal Democrats, is that once we see what Brexit means, then we should have a chance to see whether that's what we actually want. Now, that seems to me not to be ignoring or rejecting the result of the first referendum. It's just following democracy through to its logical conclusion. People said, yes, I think we should leave the EU, but mostly without a prospectus. Is the offer that, you know, being told they could have their cake and eat it, effectively, being told by some people it will be inside the single market, by other people it will be outside the single market. So when they see what the offer actually is, then it seems to me completely valid to say, well, at that point, we get to see if that's still what we want. So that's why we campaigned for, and we will continue to campaign for, a ratification referendum at the end of the negotiation process. Oh yes, now the election and the Isle of Wight. So the problem with the general election was nobody knew what it was about. The Prime Minister said it was about Brexit. That rapidly disappeared. It actually became about public services and austerity primarily, I would say, but it also became about electing a Prime Minister. So it kind of turned into a somewhat presidential election. May looked weak, Corbyn looked attractive, votes swung that way. But the problem is, again, that's not how our constitution is supposed to work. You're supposed to vote for an MP. The reason people defend the first-past-the-post system is because they value the constituency link, it's said. So, you know, you're supposed to vote for your representative, they make up a government, the government selects the... This is the theory. Obviously, in practice, that's not what's happening, and because of social media and media generally, we're moving much more to a system where people vote on the basis of what they've seen on TV. I saw polling recently that said that only 6% of people voted for their local candidate. That really cheered me up, given that I lost, of course. But, you know, I mean, if that's the case, if 90% of people are voting on the basis of what they see on TV, then what's the logic of the way we run a campaign based around local candidates? So I just think it's another example of a very messed up system. And certainly before the election, you could make a very strong case that we were a multi-party country being crammed into this sort of two-party system. And although, you know, the two parties received considerably larger share of the vote than they did in 2015, I think we're all aware of people that voted for those parties when that wasn't their first choice, voted for tactical reasons. Tactical voting reached an all-time high. And to me, it's also clear that both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party are two parties in one. And if we could move towards a multi-party system, if we could move towards a proportional electoral system, then both those parties would split, and we would have the multi-party system that you see in most European countries. And that's why, I mean, in a way, it's a bit like our railways. You know, we're hampered by the fact that we got into democracy early. We're sort of hampered by the fact that, you know, we were the first people to build railways, and both those systems are out of date and need to be upgraded, I would say. And that's where we come to the third question about constitutional reform. I mean, there are so many things wrong with the Constitution. So what are we going to do about that? I mean, it's quite hard, you know. What do you want? Written constitution. When do you want it? No, you know, it's quite hard to go out in the streets and campaign for that sort of thing. If you're interested in that, Make Votes Matter are doing an absolutely fantastic job. And if you can do anything to support them, that's a very good way of taking this forward. They basically encourage you to get into a dialogue with your local MP about the issue of a fair voting system, and they're collecting a list of MPs that will support it. But it's also going to take, you know, it is going to take mobilisation, because the problem is the people who have power are the people that we need to decide to change it. But that's succeeded in the past. I mean, the country is becoming ungovernable, and the government has increasingly little legitimacy, I would say, and it's when you get to that point that, you know, democracy to survive has to be seriously changed. And I also think it's worth seeing if there's legal cases. I'm going to certainly myself investigate the possibility of a legal case over proportional representation. One was taken then in the 1970s, but I would say the argument that all votes should be equal. It's clear in our country all votes are not equal. If you live in a marginal, your vote has a lot more influence over policy and influence over politicians than if you live in a safe seat. So, yeah, I mean, to me, this is absolutely the priority now. You can see from the political problems we've got that there are fundamental design flaws with our democracy, and so anything you can do, anything I can do, I think is really a priority.
It's difficult to see the hall clearly, and that must be the reason why I'm not able to see any women standing. Ah, good, fine, okay.
Thank you very, very much, Molly. Thank you very, very much for your presentation. That was brilliant. It's covered such a lot of the things that concern lots of us here. And thank you very much for speaking at the Tolpuddle Festival also, because obviously that's quite a different audience. I'm from the southwest myself, so I think it's really, really important that you do relate to the trade union movement too. So thank you for that. I've got 2 points really. One is, as Quakers, we worked extremely hard to get the ban treaty, to get a lot more publicity across. I work for Quaker Peace and Social Witness, so we had a staff member there. There were daily updates of the process of the whole thing, and there was an absolute absence of any coverage in the national press. And we represented a whole range of churches and Quakers internationally there. We had lots and lots of information about it, and it is an extraordinary achievement to have such a treaty. So, but I do think there's a very, very deliberate squeezing out of any real discussion of peace issues at all in the national press in Britain. My question is moving from protest to policy. Of course, we want our young people to serve in public life, ideally. Lots of them have a very strong sense of the role of protest and have been brought up, raised understanding protest and involved in many. But there's a big shift and sometimes a sort of feeling that you're letting a position down if you then put down your placard, put on a suit and go into the policy room. And I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that. Thank you.
Another question, perhaps. Yes.
Molly. I'm glad to hear your lecture. I've been in something approaching despair about the perceived standards of public life and the level of corruption that seems to be around Rupert Murdoch having cosy chats with the Prime Minister on an almost monthly basis. But I do accept that, as you say, there are a lot of good and principled men and women in politics. And it's been an interesting talk. My question to you is, what do you make of the current behaviour of Tony Blair, who seems to be acting as though Chilcot hasn't happened and talking about setting up new political parties and getting back into politics again, and he doesn't seem to realise that this major inquiry has indicted him?
One more. Molly will take one more here.
Grace doesn't. Yeah, Grace doesn't seem to be up to it.
No.
Tell Grace to just say.
Would he?
Tell Grace that behind Grace. Yeah. To the right. Grace is. You can take that.
I hope that most people are aware that marches are going to start in the autumn for Remain, notably one in Brighton during the Labour Party conference, and in November, that's in September, and in November, one in Manchester at the time of the Conservative conference. My view is that, and I think that the talk has confirmed this, that Brexit will only be stopped if we, the people, stop it. So attendance on those marches may be very important. If we sit on our hands and the marches are a failure, that will be the end of it. If the marches are hugely successful, that will be very important. So my question to the speaker is, how can what the people do on marches be reinforced by what organizations can do? And in particular, of course, because we're the Religious Society of Friends, but at the moment have a neutral position, is there anything that we can do to help stop this madness? For example, could meetings be asked to consider the present political situation? That's probably all that would be needed. It wouldn't be necessary to take sides.
So coming to the, I do think it's incredibly important that we all stand by trade unions. I think, I mean, as a Green, I'm very pleased that they invite me every year to Tolpuddle, because it's easy to see trade unions as something that belongs to Labour, and that's obviously completely wrong. Everybody who's at work, in my view, should join a trade union, and I'm very supportive of them, and I'm very clear on that point. On the issue of getting peace discussion into the media, I'm sure you've done this, but I found it's much better to just choose one person, you know, and just get to know one person that'll make this their issue, especially if they're a younger person who's trying to make their name. You know, this is a big issue that hasn't been reported on, so there's scope for somebody, and just endlessly sort of be a bit relentless with that person, I think, is the only advice I can offer. But I agree with you, it's tremendously disappointing, particularly when it's good news. You think people would want to hear about it. And on the question of young people, I think really the most, I mean, young people do come to me and say, you know, they're really inspired to become involved in politics, and that's really cheering. But I do think that the general running down of politics is very much what puts people off. And so I think it's really important that we don't do that. And then in our own way, as much as we can, we encourage and mentor young people when that's appropriate. But I would also remind you about what I mentioned, this engaging young adult Quakers project. You know, I think that sounds like an ideal way to encourage young friends to be involved in politics. And there is also, what is there, the Young Friends? I can't remember what it's called, but anyway. There we are, Young Friends General Meeting, thank you, exactly.
Thank you.
Exactly. And maybe trying to get people like me and Catherine to be involved in that, if that's helpful. Yeah, the Enigma of Tony Blair. I mean, I think it's true to say that, I know that when he made what I thought was an absolutely fantastic speech. It's interesting because I read it. I was in Belgium and I read the text of the speech, so I didn't see him delivering it. And I don't think he wrote it, but you know, if I'd seen him delivering it, no doubt I would have been gnashing my teeth and I wouldn't have been able to agree with him. But I think the content of the speech was 100% spot on, a speech he gave about Brexit. And I think, you know, when we all read that speech, those of us who are opposed to Brexit, we were saying, oh God, what a great speech, but why was it him? No. And I think, I mean, he is so toxic now, it's almost like he'll damage the cause if he's associated with it. So whatever he may say, and however much he might have money and influential friends and so on, he is never going to make a return to politics. And that I find is an encouraging sign. People have not forgotten and they have not forgiven, and they won't, I think. So there's something encouraging there, but it is also discouraging that somebody like him can apparently act with complete impunity when the cost is so vast. And there doesn't seem to be any crime that he's committed that is written down in law that he can be made accountable for. And as far as I understand it, the International Criminal Court cannot act. It's creating such a crime, but it doesn't exist, or it didn't exist at the time, you know, in 2003. But I'm sure great minds are still doing their best to bring him to justice. Yeah, on the day that the Chilcot report came out, the day I was flat on my back with a migraine, it was so frustrating. And afterwards, when I recovered, I could see my staff had been all sort of emailing backwards and forwards. She has to say something on this, you know, she'll want us to say something. So we had a sort of text prepared, but it was, you know, in the end, I ended up saying, you know, Tony Blair should answer these allegations from the dock. And I think absolutely he should. And, you know, I was very pleased that we were able to put that statement out because, yeah, I mean, most people in this country think that's the case, but unfortunately we don't have the legal process to enable that. Yeah, I'm not sure about we the people. Is there any we the people? You know, we the people in this room, are we representative? Clearly not, you know, and then there's, who are we the people anyway? We're a massively diverse group of people who hold all sorts of different views and change our minds, and so I'm finding it a rather unappealing phrase now, we the people. But yes, we do have to get active. I mean, I'm sure there are people in this room who voted to leave, and you know, every community is divided on this issue. But if you are one of those people that thinks Brexit is a catastrophe, then yes, I think we should be mobilised. I think we should be attending the marches. But I have to say it's quite hard to just imagine the technicalities of the process whereby we reverse this decision. If that's what's in the best interest of the country and the majority of the people in the country think that's what we should do, then that's absolutely legitimate to try to do that. But the actual mechanism for doing that is not straightforward. I mean, the extraordinary thing is that although the overwhelming majority of MPs who were there before the last election are still there, and the overwhelming majority of them thought Brexit will be a disaster. But now the overwhelming majority are implementing something they think would be a disaster. And that's just an extraordinary thing to watch happening. But the truth is, to stop it, we have to effect a cross-party working. And that's what's so difficult in the British Constitution. And there are moves to do that, but I'm sure you know that when the amendment, even just on the single market, was put down, it received 100 votes out of 650, so it was well lost. And yeah, we need to, I think one of the things I'm trying to do is just to encourage politicians in my patch to work as part of that cross-party organisation and just to work across the divide in the interests of the country. But that's something that's very difficult. Politics in this country is incredibly tribal and it's binary. And so to get the two parties to work together, no Tories voted for Chukkaram and a single market amendment, 49 Labour, no Tories, although huge, probably half of them realised the importance of it. So anyway, I agree. If you believe that this is a disaster for the country, of course you should be on the march and you should be doing everything you can. And I'm certainly doing that. Is not number one on our priority list in my team.
We've got time for one more round of questions.
Now everybody, take it on now.
Yes.
Grace.
Yeah.
Grace has got the microphone. Grace has got the microphone.
Would it be possible to have a second referendum once the Brexit deal has been finalised to take it to the country?
Next. Some over there. Oh, right.
That's what I'm trying to tell you.
Hello. Good evening. The bit that struck me about the Chilcot report was the head of...
I can hear.
Sorry. The bit that struck me about the Chilcot report was when the head of MI6 was described as an unpleasant bully who enjoyed his FaceTime with the Prime Minister. And recently there was a programme on BBC Two, Horizon, describing the computer virus that shut down the NHS. Part of that virus came from the NSA, the National Security Agency, an American organisation. My question is... And on that programme, it was stated that the security services have no interest in protecting us. That virus was part of a stockpile that was kept in, just for if it came in useful. So my question is, why is no politician seems prepared to take on the security services?
Good question.
Another one, perhaps.
Should we have 3 or 4 and just see?
3 or 4?
Just have a few more.
A few more, right, okay.
We can't probably cover everybody.
Where?
Halfway up.
Yes.
On the right-hand side.
Douglas Rennie from Northumbria.
The young woman there?
Grace.
The dark hair?
Dark hair.
That guy up there had a microphone. Oh, he hasn't got it now.
It's a bit of a linked question to the question about the referendum, because when you explained the argument for a second referendum as a constitutional, it makes sense. We had a vote on the idea of leaving. Once we know what that looks like, it makes sense to have another one. That sounded really reasonable and unpartisan, but the trouble is it's only people who don't accept the outcome of the first referendum or don't like it that are making that case, and it feels to me like there's still quite a lot of negativity around Brexit is stupid and disastrous and they were lied to, and that, and it doesn't feel as if the Remain camp has kind of learned the lessons of why we lost and how to kind of build a broader coalition and bring people on side and end the dividedness. So I wonder if you could comment on that, please.
Yeah, there's well, that guy there was already speaking, wasn't he?
Which one?
That guy there was already speaking. Yeah. Do you want to ask your question?
I think the last friend asked it.
Okay.
We expect people to have good information to argue these points, which you have put forward, but also with young people doing this, but with the education system as we have it at the moment, surely we need something a lot better for young people and those who come in after us to be able to grasp these and hold the policy makers to their task.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so on the second referendum and Brexit, it was interesting. After the referendum, Theresa May was proposing to do all sorts of things, and my friends in Brussels, especially the German ones, were all saying, well, can she do that? And I was having to say, well, she can get away with it, she can do it, you know, because that's what happens when you don't have a written constitution, and Germans are horrified by that. You know, it would say clearly in their Grundgesetz, or whatever it's called, you know, you can have a referendum, it's this percentage if it's a major constitutional change, and you can't reverse it for this many years, and it would all be written down. So can we have a second referendum? Yeah, if we can create enough pressure for it, then we can. That's just the nature of our political system, and anyway, it has disadvantages, but it has the advantage if you can create enough momentum, then you can make things happen. But the much deeper question about what that would do in the country, I think, is a really important one. And the divisions, you know, particularly because it's more or less half and half, are bitter, and in my observation are actually becoming worse. You know, it's almost like we're moving away from each other rather than coming together, and I think the way Brexit's being handled is making that worse. And one of the things that I'm trying to get organised from my team is a process called Divided Countries, Shared Future. Somebody else called it that, but I think it's a really great title. And it's just a process whereby you encourage leavers and remainers in individual communities to just have a conversation about what they think Brexit will look like. So you're not saying, I'm right, you're wrong. You're just sort of saying, well, how will Brexit improve this? You know, what will Brexit do in terms of farming or education? It's kind of just having that conversation, because my observation is that a lot of people who voted to leave actually had all sorts of motivations, but one of the motivations was simply that they were fed up with not being heard. And actually, being heard is a really important part of what we need to do. We need to be listening on both sides. And so I think this is something you can do in your communities. You know, this process doesn't belong to me. It's just, and it doesn't have to be this particular process. But I think what you do need to do that is firstly to have leavers who will come and join the process, and that's probably quite a challenge. And you need extremely good facilitators to make that process effective. But, you know, I'm sure plenty of people in this room are capable of doing that. I think from the point of view of the country as a whole, it's probably the most important thing that we need to be doing, because it feels like in every community in the country there are serious divisions which are not being healed. Taking on the security services, well, I can think of an obvious reason you might not want to do that, but I haven't, since I've not been elected to Parliament, it's never sort of been in my remit. I think, didn't Tom Watson have a go at that? But I think he did abandon it. So anyway, I don't know enough about how the security services work and who they're accountable to. There is some kind of indirect accountability to politicians, but I agree it's not very strong, and it does sound like an area that that is important for somebody to look at. It's not obviously in my mandate or remit as a member of the European Parliament. Yes, citizenship education, I think somebody raised that. You know, we expect people to make decisions when they simply don't understand what the decision is all about. I mean, that's true. You know, if you've fought local elections, people don't have a clue about the difference between a local election and a general election. There's just no real grasp on what you can't have a democracy if people don't understand the power that they're wielding with their vote. So, I mean, I think it's disgraceful that citizenship education has been downplayed, and it should be enhanced. But I've noticed actually that in schools, I've been made much more welcome in schools recently. It seems that head teachers have just decided they don't need to ban politicians anymore. We launched an air pollution report in a Bristol school. We were very welcome. They had photos of the children in all the papers and on TV, and they were very happy to do that. And there was a school in very Tory Devon that invited me in, and I spoke to the whole school, about as many people as are here, and afterwards the headmistress was very excited, and she rushed up to me and said, "Oh, it was wonderful. They were coming out as if they were carrying lanterns and pitchforks," she said to me, in a very excited way. So, I thought I'd probably done what I was supposed to do then. That's good. But yes, just lastly to say, you know, there's nothing particular about politicians. I mean, I think this is very true in the Green Party, that most people who become politicians are just those people that have got fed up with everybody else messing it up and thought, oh, I suppose I'll just have to do that then. And, you know, I think it's really important that everybody feels that that's a part of their democratic duty. I mean, we tend to feel strongly that we need to go and vote, but that's not the extent of democracy. You know, if you look at the selection and you don't like what it looks like, then the next step is to put yourself forward. So that's a challenge to you all.
Friends, I'm afraid it's now time to draw the session to an end. I'm sorry we can't take any more questions. If you wish to support the Salter Lecture, there's a leaflet with details of how you can best do so. Please hand that in to the stewards. I'm sure you'll agree with me that Molly has addressed in just over an hour some of the most serious and difficult questions of our time. So our thanks to her. And thank you too for attending and for your excellent questions. Thank you.